Saviour since thou art born, without looking at the words, because we're used to the old version. Leah asked me the other day what I was going to be speaking about this morning, and I said just flippantly, oh, maybe the Easter story. And she laughed and she thought it very applicable, as the crucifixion and all that was in God's plan for Jesus coming to earth was all part of it. But I said I was going to be talking about Joseph, but not the one with the Technicolor Dreamcoat. Have you ever wondered why God chose Joseph to be the earthly guardian of his son Jesus? What is it that we see when we look at Joseph? He wasn't nobility, although he was descended from King David's family, but that was a lot of generations ago. He didn't have a big business to make him wealthy. He wasn't even on the Nazareth City Council to have some social standing there. And I'm sure he didn't live in a fine mansion house. So why did God choose Joseph? Maybe as we look at Joseph, we can see some of the reasons. It said that he was a God-fearing man, which is always a good start, isn't it? But how do we know that? We read that he was obedient when God spoke to him 3 times in 3 different dreams. He didn't ask for any confirmation of the message or any second answer, just the same as Gideon did. He wanted to see the fleece wet and he wanted to see it dry and the ground dry and so on. God said it, and Joseph believed it. Have you ever had a dream where you've heard your name spoken directly in it? It doesn't really happen, does it? You know that when you're in a dream that you're part of it. I had a strange dream the other night. In it, Doris and I were being chased in the car by the traffic police for some minor offence. And the more the dream went on, the deeper trouble we got into as we tried to escape. It was just a silly dream. And, afterwards you think, how daft was that? In dreams we often find that we're the prime actor in most plots, aren't we? But I think if our name was spoken directly in a dream to us, we'd take notice and think, I better listen to this is something for me. We read that Joseph listened and obeyed, realising that it was God who had spoken to him. And then secondly about Joseph, he wanted to keep God's law and yet still be caring to others. We see how he cared for and was considerate for Mary. At the time, Joseph didn't know the origin of this baby she was carrying, and so he thought that he would quietly divorce her to save her any disgrace and from any danger, because in that area, stoning for adultery often happened, so it was quite a dangerous thing. Written divorce was the way in those days to end a formal engagement and propose marriage. But when God showed Joseph the answer, he took Mary home as his wife. You see, God changed his thinking and his decisions. He was subject to God's direction. Although I can quite imagine he would probably face a stern grilling from his family about the situation, but he kept firmly to his resolve to be obedient to God. Another thing we read about Joseph, he was honest and he was law-abiding. He obeyed the Roman order for the census and travelled to Bethlehem when it would have been much easier to have made excuses and stayed in Nazareth and kept hidden when the roll call came. God gives authority to those who are set in charge over us, and we should obey them. Jesus reminded the Pharisee of that when he was asked by the Pharisee as to who the Jews should serve. Jesus showed him the image on the coin, and he said, give to Caesar what's due, and give to God what's due to him. Joseph was trustworthy. He trusted God to protect them and the unborn baby on the journey to Bethlehem. As good Jews, they were expected to journey from Nazareth to Jerusalem a few times during the year, every year, to celebrate the festivals. So they were used to walking long distances. But this was with a heavily pregnant wife. I looked it up. Nowadays you'd say I Googled it, but I didn't. I looked it up elsewhere. It's about 85 to 90 miles, depending on which route they took. You either go through Samaria, where the Jews didn't like travelling because they didn't like the Samaritans. It was a no-go, was that. And it's which is more direct, but it has more steep hills on it. But the other is through the Jordan Valley and Jericho. That's flatter, but it's a bit steep up the last part from Jericho into Bethlehem. And thinking about it, I guess it must have taken them maybe anywhere between 6 to 10 days for the journey, depending on what the weather was like and what the travelling conditions were like. Joseph didn't go alone, although he could have done, but he took Mary with him. He didn't leave her behind, probably because he considered that she was safer with him to care for her than leave her at Nazareth, where her unknown pregnancy could have put her in danger from hostile villagers. As they journeyed, they would probably be going with a group of people all travelling together for safety, and they'd all be going to different places in southern Israel to register for this census. The journey couldn't have been easy for Joseph and Mary, so why did God allow this to be so hard for a young girl carrying his soon-to-be-born son? You know, we don't know God's plan and purpose for us, or for that, or for many other happenings in the world. And it's a question I find that when I'm asked it by non-Christians, how could God allow this catastrophe? Or how could God allow that problem or that difficulty? And I must admit, I'm so often at a loss to know how to answer. We just have to trust that God's plan is perfect. He never says it's going to be easy to obey him. And Joseph would know from hearing the scriptures read, just as we do, that many prophets in the Old Testament struggled with great hardship, but they remained faithful and obedient to God. We read many of them in the chapter of faith in Hebrews. And even now at present, many Christians, both in our country and all over the world, are suffering death, hardship and worry in life, even now. And it's all because they trust in God. Back to Joseph and Mary. They finally got to Bethlehem, didn't they? We know that in the story. We don't know the full implications of the culture of the time about providing shelter for relatives who were calling on a journey needing shelter for a night. But we read that there wasn't the usual accommodation available. Maybe far too many other relatives had arrived early and were occupying the guest rooms. Joseph and Mary had to take what was left, a room next to the animals. You know, we see on some of the lovely Christmas cards, it depicts a nice, clean, comfortable stable with docile, cuddly-looking cattle and donkeys. And that was probably far from the reality, wasn't it? It was probably a really unhygienic place for the earthly birth of the Lord of Glory. I guess we could quite understand it if Joseph had been thinking as he settled Mary into this wonderful accommodation, I must have got this wrong. God wouldn't have his son born here in a place like this. But what a confirmation God gave to him, for this was God's plan. There were angels appearing in the sky, singing God's praises. And that was a lot more spectacular than the fiery meteor shower that was in the sky on Wednesday night. And then there was roughly dressed shepherds who came to visit. Well, they were a bit weird, because we all know what roughly dressed shepherds look like, don't they? But they said an angel had spoke to them, saying that God the Messiah had been born. Where had he been born? Right here in Bethlehem, wrapped in strips of cloth, and they'd come to see him. That must have been encouraging to Joseph, to trust in the Lord with all his heart. It hadn't been a dream, but God's message to him. It was true that they were here and that they were in the right place. We're not told the full timescale of events of how long they stayed there for the census, or that they moved into a home. We don't know whether Joseph did some work to provide for his family, for food. We don't know all the minor details, do we? But after so many days, we read that Joseph and Mary complied with God's law and presented the baby Jesus at the temple in Jerusalem, where Simeon and Anna saw him, and they both prophesied concerning who this special baby was. And then Joseph and Mary returned to Bethlehem. I wonder at that time, was Joseph maybe wondering, well, what do I do next? Do we stay in Bethlehem here? It's King David's birthplace. Shall we wait and let the baby grow stronger before we go back to Nazareth? Or what should we do? We're not sure just how much later it was that the Magi those feared, influential, wealthy rulers from a great distance east of Israel came to visit, because we know it would have taken them a long time to get there. The visit of the Magi, telling why they'd come and how they knew that there was a great king had been born, and a star that had guided them to Bethlehem, reminded Joseph of the wonderful baby he was being entrusted to care for and protect. You know, to have these powerful astrologers bowing down to baby Jesus showed the great respect and the adoration they had for him, and the gifts that they brought. Well, there was more gold than Joseph had probably ever seen in his life. Frankincense, well, that was a fragrant resin that only the priests were allowed to use in the temple for the worship of God. That too was very, very expensive and very special. And myrrh, well, that was a bit of a strange gift to bring for a baby, wasn't it? It was normally used on the body of someone who had died, but they were all gifts fit for a king. Thinking about gifts, it made me just think of a story. Did you hear about the man who was going to celebrate a special birthday? His wife asked him, "What would you like?" You know, something really special. And he thought, well, he would like all sorts of things. Maybe an electric runabout car or an electric van to go about in his business. Maybe an aircraft for himself. He could even build a helicopter pad on his back garden if it was a helicopter, or a speedboat. But he didn't tell her any of them. He thought, I'll just see what happens, see what she gives me, and I'll be happy when something suitable comes. Well, the big day came, and sitting down to breakfast, there was a big parcel on the table, and it was a big parcel. What do you think it could have been? Maybe it was a box with a set of car keys in it, or maybe a kit to build an aircraft, or even one of those electric flying zones that are really difficult to drive. He tore open the wrapping paper. The box had written on the side of it, electric plane. Wow, it was one of those fast-flying eco-electric models, maybe. Well, wasn't he a fortunate birthday boy to have something like that, a real live electric plane? And when he tried it, it was super. Well, you see, he actually wasn't able to get in it and fly it, but it was a real super present for smoothing down wood. And he meant that he could make his wife a big new workshop door. So the gift was just the right thing, and it made everyone happy. A few days ago, our Anna Ruth asked me what Joseph and Mary did with the gifts, the gold, the frankincense and the myrrh. And I had to tell her I'd never just thought about it, and I didn't really know any answer. I gave her a few ideas, but I think, although they were symbolic, they were all part of God's provision for them as a family. We remember that the Magi had made a stop en route at Jerusalem and inquired from Herod's palace where the King of the Jews was to be born, and the furor that caused. But after they had seen Jesus, they weren't going back the way that they'd come to report they'd found and actually worshipped him. They went back another way. God again spoke to Joseph in a dream. He said, "Get up and take Mary and the baby Jesus and escape to Egypt." As we read the story, it gives us the impression that Joseph didn't dither about. He didn't make excuses. Oh, it's cold, it's dark, it's raining outside, I'm tired. But it almost gives the impression that he roused them from sleep, packed the bags, and set off on the road south towards Egypt during that night. Often when we read in the Old Testament about battles and soldiers and warfare, we read that soldiers often, if they were attacking a town or a village, they would travel during the night and they'd come and surround it, so that when daylight appeared, they could control all the roads and the paths in and out of the village and march into the town or village without anyone escaping. They'd got everybody trapped. Maybe that was what Herod's soldiers were going to do, but whatever it was, they were too late. Joseph had been obedient to God's instructions, and it saved their lives. But now he had another difficulty to face, to go and to live in a foreign country. There would be fugitives there. The Egyptians, well, they'd always been enemies towards Israel, haven't they? Ever since the days of Moses. How would Joseph manage with a wife and baby to provide for? He'd have no rights in Egypt as a foreigner. Not really that poor people did have any rights in Egypt. With no friends near, all they could do was just trust themselves to God's protection and care. It must have tested Joseph's faith in God. Then we hear of much time later, Joseph had a third dream. God spoke to him again in it, that he could return to Israel, to his homeland. Herod, the one who tried to kill baby Jesus, was dead. They could go back home to Nazareth. But even there they would have to trust God to see him through, because of all the sly insults and comments that they no doubt still get from neighbours and relatives and villagers, for they would remember the unusual circumstances of Mary's pregnancy and their marriage. So what can we really learn from Joseph's example? He seemed to be a very ordinary man, but he'd been chosen by God. He had to learn to trust God's timetable for things. He had to listen to God's voice. He had to be obedient when he heard it. He had not to be afraid of the opinions of others when he was following God's leading. He'd got to learn to trust that God would provide for them and protect them, and to marvel at the wonderful opportunity and the task that God had given him. In his case, it was to care for God's Son, the Messiah, the Redeemer, the Saviour of the world. Probably the villagers in Nazareth saw nothing noteworthy in Joseph. He was a carpenter. So what? But God saw him. God knew about him. And God wanted him to care for his son. The people in the capital in Persia probably saw nothing of note in Mordecai, but God knew about him and used him to advise Esther the queen to help save the Jewish people. At one time, Paul didn't see anything special in John Mark. In fact, we get the impression Paul thought him a bit useless. But God knew about him, and he had a job in mind for John Mark later on, and he was a great help to Paul. These weren't kings, they weren't great warriors, they weren't preachers to multitudes, they weren't even famous people. They were just ordinary people like us. They didn't know what plans God had for them, but they trusted him even though the road was sometimes hard and very often difficult. You know, ourselves, we may not feel very special, we may not feel we have particular gifts, but we are special to God because he's chosen us for the job that he wants us to do. It might not be spectacular. We might not think it's very special. In fact, we might feel it's something very, very ordinary. But that's God's plan for us. May we trust him. May we rely on him. May we be faithful and obedient to him. Amen. We're going to sing